Heavy drops of London rain drummed on the brim of the top hat, creating a monotonous rhythm that merged with the clatter of iron rims on the cobblestone street. The gentleman in a long frock coat of expensive cloth stood frozen at the edge of the pavement, like a ship's captain facing an insurmountable sea. Before him stretched not just a street, but a swirling, viscous substance of dark color that lived a life of its own. It was a mixture of clay, coal dust, and, most importantly, the consequences of the vital activity of thousands of horses that passed through the city center daily. To take a step forward meant not just to soil one's boots, but perhaps to forever ruin the reputation of an impeccable gentleman, appearing at a meeting in a manner unworthy of decent society. The lady standing next to him, gripping a lace umbrella tightly, looked with horror at the hem of her cream-colored dress. For her, this street was not just an obstacle, but a real threat. One wrong move by a passing cab, one splash from a hoof, and the intricate outfit, costing a fortune, would be hopelessly ruined. In those days, dry cleaning had not yet reached the heights capable of dealing with the street chemistry of a large city. And so, when despair was already beginning to overcome the pedestrians, a small figure appeared from the fog, like a ghost. It was a boy, seemingly no older than 10, dressed in rags that had once been an adult man's jacket. The sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and on his feet were boots clearly taken from someone else's feet, perhaps found in a dump. But in his hands, he held a tool that at that moment was more important than a monarch's scepter, a simple, coarse broom made of birch twigs. Without a word, he plunged into the thick of the mud. His movements were precise and swift, like a fencer's. A sweep to the left, a sweep to the right, a sharp lunge forward. The mud, which seemed invincible, obediently parted, forming a narrow but relatively clean path leading to the other side of the street. The boy raised his head. His face was smudged with soot, but his eyes burned with professional zeal. He bowed slightly, inviting the gentleman and lady to cross this temporary bridge of civilization. The gentleman, exhaling with relief, stepped onto the cleared path, and the lady, lifting her skirts, scurried after him, miraculously preserving the whiteness of her lace. Reaching the safe opposite pavement, the man reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small coin, a penny or a halfpenny. The coin transferred to the dirty palm of the savior. The transaction was complete. This was how one of the most astonishing and forgotten institutions of 19th century urban life worked. To understand why this scene was repeated thousands of times a day at every intersection in the major cities of Europe and America, one must delve into the atmosphere of that time, when the urban environment was hostile to man in the most literal sense. We are accustomed to perceiving the road as a solid, predictable surface, but a century and a half ago, the city street was a living organism producing tons of waste. The transport system relied on the muscle power of horses. In London alone in the mid-19th century, there were more than 50,000 horses, daily transporting goods and passengers. Each animal left behind kilograms of manure. Multiply that by the number of days, add rain, fog, and the absence of modern storm drains, and you get a recipe for disaster. In dry weather, this substance turned into acrid dust that clogged lungs and settled on windows. In the rain, it became a liquid swamp, the depth of which could reach the ankle. Municipal services, of course, existed, but their effectiveness was extremely low. They cleaned the streets rarely, often at night, and their efforts were only enough to prevent the city from completely drowning. In these conditions, a vacuum arose, which was filled by the private initiative of the poorest strata of the population. No one officially hired these people. They had no unions, no workbooks, or guaranteed salaries. They were entrepreneurs in the purest, most Darwinian sense of the word. They were called crossing sweepers. This was a caste of people who sold the only thing they had, their labor and their time, in exchange for the comfort of those who were more fortunate. It would seem, what could be simpler? Take a broom and sweep the street. But behind this simplicity lay a complex social structure, its unwritten laws, hierarchy, and even wars over territory. A crossing was not just a workplace, it was capital. A good crossing in a wealthy neighborhood, where affluent people often walked, could feed an entire family. A spot near a bank, a theater, or a fashionable shop was considered a gold mine. Such spots were inherited, sold for considerable money, or won in brutal street skirmishes. A person who owned a broom at the corner of Regent Street and Oxford Street could earn more than a factory worker who toiled 14 hours a day. However, this world was not homogeneous. There was a strict division among the sweepers. At the top of the pyramid stood the aristocrats of the broom, people who had served the same crossing for years, sometimes even decades. They knew every resident of the block by name. They greeted bankers by name, knew when the milliner's workday ended, and remembered which day of the week the old colonel went to his club. These sweepers were an integral part of the landscape. Residents grew accustomed to them just as they did to lampposts or shop signs. The disappearance of such a person became an event discussed at dinner. Surprisingly, among these professionals, there were also those who once belonged to a completely different circle. There are stories of ruined merchants or former soldiers for whom the broom became the last way to preserve dignity and avoid begging. The line between begging and sweeping was thin but fundamental. A beggar asked for money outright, appealing to pity. A sweeper offered a service. Even if the street was dry and clean, he would still feign vigorous activity, sweeping invisible dust motes before a passing gentleman, demonstrating his readiness to serve. This was a psychological game. A gentleman paid not so much for clean shoes as for the confirmation of his status and the feeling of having fulfilled his duty to the least of these. But the overwhelming majority of this army consisted of children and the elderly. Those who could not work in factories or mines due to physical weakness found their place at the crossings. For orphans, this was the only way to survive without resorting to theft. Girls and boys with brooms, often barefoot even in cold weather, evoked mixed feelings in passers-by. On the one hand, it was a poignant picture of childhood misery. On the other, it was a convenient service. Victorian society, bound by strict moral and propriety codes, found solace in this. The child is not stealing, he is working, which means he is on the right path. However, reality was far harsher than romantic notions. Competition was merciless. If a stranger came to a bread-winning spot, he could be brutally beaten and driven away. Not only fists were used, but also the brooms themselves, smeared with dirt. There were gangs that controlled entire areas and exacted tribute from individuals. In this microcosm, all the vices and virtues of the larger world were reflected: greed, mutual assistance, cruelty, and nobility. A most interesting phenomenon was the informational function of the sweepers. Standing in one place from morning till night, they saw and heard everything. They were the living surveillance cameras of that era. Who met whom and when? Whose carriage stood at the back entrance of a famous actress's house? Who delivered a note to a married lady? The sweeper knew the answers. And this information had a price. Police constables investigating crimes often turn to these people for tips. Private detectives, hired by jealous husbands, paid for information about their wives' whereabouts. But most often, sweepers served as postmen for love letters. Delivering a note through official mail was slow and unreliable, and servants could blab to their masters. A grubby boy with a broom was invisible. One could slip him a folded piece of paper and a coin, whispering a description of the recipient who would soon pass by. And one could be sure the message would be delivered. This role as messengers made them keepers of many secrets of high society. Paradoxically, the dirtiest people in the city often held the reputations of the cleanest and noblest families in their hands. The inner world of these people remained a mystery to those who tossed them coins. What did a person feel who daily saw luxury but was forced to clear away manure to merely glimpse that luxury? Many of them developed their own philosophy. There is a known case of a sweeper named Billy who worked near the Houses of Parliament. He considered himself almost a civil servant, claiming that without his work, laws could not be passed, as MPs simply wouldn't reach the assembly hall in clean boots. This sense of self-importance, however illusory, helped them maintain their humanity in inhumane conditions. There were also tragic fates. Many children working in the cold winds quickly lost their health. Chronic lung diseases, rheumatism, and infections were their constant companions. Their lifespan was short, and often a sweeper's career ended in a poorhouse or an unmarked grave. But as one left, another immediately took their place, picking up the dropped broom. The conveyor belt of need never stopped for a minute. From the perspective of ideological conflict, the existence of crossroads sweepers exposed a deep chasm between technological progress and social structure. The 19th century was the age of steam, electricity, and the telegraph, yet medieval mud still squelched under people's feet. Society was ready to build railways across continents, but could not solve the problem of street cleaning. Sweepers were a living reproach to the system, a patch on the tattered dress of civilization. They existed in a gray area of the law. Formally, vagrancy was forbidden, and the police regularly conducted raids, arresting those who too insistently demanded payment. But it was impossible to completely ban their activity because the city would simply grind to a halt. It was a silent agreement. The authorities turned a blind eye to violations of begging laws, and the army of the poor ensured the functioning of transportation arteries. The turning point in this story did not come suddenly but crept in gradually, along with the rumble of asphalt pavers and the smell of hot bitumen. Technological progress, which had long ignored the problem of streets, finally reached the roadways. First came macadam, a gravel surface that was better than cobblestones but still created mud. Then experiments began with wooden blocks, and finally with asphalt. Smooth, waterproof surfaces changed everything. Mud no longer accumulated in cracks. Water drained into sewers, which by then were being actively modernized. But the main blow to the sweeper's profession was the change in transport itself. The advent of bicycles, then the first automobiles and electric trams, began to displace horses from the city. The source of endless manure began to dry up. Streets became cleaner on their own, and demands for sanitation grew. Municipalities, realizing the connection between dirt and epidemics, began to create professional cleaning services. People in uniform appeared, with carts and professional equipment, receiving salaries from the city treasury. The chaotic, wild market of private cleaners' services encountered the ruthless machine of state bureaucracy and efficiency. First, the children disappeared. Laws on compulsory education and the prohibition of child labor snatched brooms from their hands, sending them to school desks. Then, the elderly began to disappear. The police became stricter in maintaining order, pushing __0_ from intersections as a relic of the past. Asphalt did not require an individual approach. It could be washed by machines. Personal contact, that very spark between the giver and the demander, disappeared. The street became sterile, functional, and impersonal. The culmination of this process can be considered the beginning of the 20th century. The world was changing rapidly. Gas lamps gave way to electric ones, carriages to cars. In this new reality, the figure of a man with a broom, bowing for a copper coin, looked archaic. Almost comical. They became heroes of nostalgic postcards and stories about, quote, one, although there was nothing good in their reality. The few who remained at their posts until the last became city attractions, living monuments to a bygone era. They stood on their corners, like captains of sinking ships, refusing to leave the bridge. Their clients, the gentlemen and ladies themselves, were also changing. The pace of life accelerated. No one wanted to stop anymore to exchange a few words or pass a note. The telephone made secret correspondence through street intermediaries unnecessary. The world became more transparent, faster, and cleaner, but at the same time, colder. However, the disappearance of this profession left behind an important legacy. A lesson we can learn even today. The history of street cleaners is a story of human adaptability, about how people find a way to be useful even in the most hopeless circumstances. It is a reminder that any comfort we are accustomed to often relies on the invisible labor of those we prefer not to notice. Today, we don't see children with brooms, but we see couriers delivering food in rain and snow, cleaners in office centers starting their shifts when the city sleeps. The form has changed, but the essence remains the same. There are people who make our lives convenient, remaining in the shadows. The only difference is that now, a smartphone screen often stands between us and them, not a broom handle. Moreover, the phenomenon of cleaners makes one ponder the price of progress. We conquered dirt, paved cities with concrete and asphalt, but lost that unique social fabric that connected different layers of society. At a dirty intersection in the 19th century, a millionaire and a pauper met face to face. They looked each other in the eye. There was an exchange of energy, money, gratitude. Today, we can live a lifetime in a metropolis without truly interacting with someone from a different social circle. The sterility of the streets led to a certain sterility of human relationships. We became cleaner, but did we become more humane? Concluding this tale, let us return to the very crossroads where we began. Imagine the rain has stopped, the clouds have dispersed, and the pale sun illuminates the wet pavement. The boy clutches a coin in his hand, which will secure his dinner, a piece of bread and perhaps a bowl of hot broth. He watches the departing couple. He doesn't know that in 50 years his profession will vanish, that a wide highway will be laid in this spot, along which gleaming cars will speed. He lives here and now. He is the king of this small, dirty patch of land. He is the master of clean paths. At this moment, he is a victor. He has conquered chaos, pushed aside the dirt, and allowed people to move forward. And though his name may not appear in history books, though his face may fade from the memory of generations, it is thanks to thousands like him that the wheels of civilization continued to turn, not getting bogged down in the mire of existence. His broom was a small oar, pushing the huge boat of humanity forward, towards a clean, bright, asphalted future in which, alas, there was no longer a place for him. Stories about them have survived only in fragments of police reports, in the background of old paintings, and in the works of great writers who, like everyone else, used their services. Charles Dickens, for instance, immortalized one such sweeper in his novel _"0_", creating the character of Poor Joe. This character became a symbol of all those nameless souls who, with brooms in hand, confronted the dirt of the big city. But literature is one thing, and real life is quite another. In reality, there wasn't always a happy ending, not always a benefactor. More often than not, it was a daily, exhausting struggle for existence. A struggle with the cold, with competitors, with the indifference of passers-by. But in this struggle, the indomitable human spirit was revealed. The ability to find a niche, to invent a service where, it would seem, nothing could be sold. For, in essence, they were selling air, empty space, free from dirt. They were the first sellers of user experience in the urban environment. It is also interesting to trace the economics of this microcosm. A penny or half-penny coin seems like a negligible sum to us today. But in the mid-19th century, that money could buy something substantial for a child. A few successful crossings could provide a day's rations, and a particularly lucky day when a generous gentleman threw a sixpence or even a shilling became a real celebration. This money was carried home into the crowded basements and attics of London's East End or New York's Five Points slums. It became a contribution to the family budget, helped redeem clothes from the pawn shop, or buy medicine for a sick mother. The economics of dirt fueled the economics of life. Money earned from cleaning the shoes of the rich circulated in the poorest neighborhoods, keeping small shops, bakeries, and lodging houses afloat. There were also curious cases that became urban legends. They told of a sweeper who, upon dying, left behind a fortune accumulated over years of frugal living. Supposedly, thousands of pounds sterling were found in his mattress. Most likely, these were myths with which the rich comforted themselves, justifying social inequality. They wanted to believe that the man with the broom was not actually suffering, but merely playing a role, concealing his wealth. This allowed them not to feel too strong pangs of conscience as they walked past an old man shivering from the cold. But even if such cases were isolated exceptions, they only underscored the rule. Most sweepers lived on the brink of survival. Another aspect that cannot be overlooked is the relationship between the sweepers and animals. City horses were not only a source of their work in the form of manure, but also a source of danger. A sweeper knocked down by a horse was a common occurrence. Horses would get scared, bolt, and carriages would skid on slippery stones. A small man with a broom needed the reaction time of a mongoose to dodge a speeding carriage. And yet, at the same time, they often fed these horses, stroked them while the carriage was stuck in traffic. There was a certain solidarity between working animals and working people. Both toiled through city life, and both were expendable in the eyes of society. With the advent of the automobile era, the city's soundscape also changed. Previously, the city resonated with the clatter of hooves and the cries of coachmen. In this din, the sweeper's voice, "Clean path, sir! Mind your shoes, ma'am!" was clearly audible. With the appearance of internal combustion engines, the noise became mechanical, loud, aggressive. The human voice drowned in the roar of engines. Communication became impossible. The automobile isolated the passenger even more reliably than a carriage. Behind glass and metal, the driver and passengers were in another world, inaccessible to the person on the street. The gesture of throwing a coin from a car window was inconvenient and dangerous. The very mechanics of paying for the service became impossible. This also played a role in the disappearance of the profession. Technology didn't just change the road surface, it erected a barrier between people. Today, walking through the historical centers of European capitals, we rarely look down with apprehension. Our shoes remain clean. We take this for granted, as a natural right of modern man. But it is worth remembering that this cleanliness is the result of a huge evolutionary path, at the beginning of which stood a small boy with a birch broom. He was a pioneer of comfort. He was the link that connected the barbarism of dirt with the civilization of cleanliness. And although his broom has long since decayed and he himself has dissolved in time, his shadow is still invisibly present at every pedestrian crossing. Every time we cross the road without getting our feet dirty, we, without knowing it, enjoy the fruits of progress that made his labor unnecessary. Paradoxically, in the modern world, the need for a human touch is returning. We are again looking for personalized service. We want to be recognized in our favorite coffee shop. We value artisanal goods and a personal approach. Perhaps we subconsciously miss those times when even crossing the street was a small social interaction. Of course, no one wants the return of dirt and poverty, but the longing for a human face in an impersonal city remains. Crossing sweepers were part of the community. They made the city theirs, homely, lived in. Without them, the streets became simply transport arteries, devoid of soul. In conclusion, it is worth saying that history abhors a vacuum. Some professions are replaced by others, but the essence of human striving to survive and be useful remains unchanged. Path sweepers are not just a historical curiosity, it is a hymn to human ingenuity and resilience. It is a reminder that even in the dirtiest circumstances, a person is capable of creating an island of cleanliness and order. And perhaps this is the main lesson: not to wait for the municipality to send a street sweeper, but to take a broom and clear the way, for yourself and for others, even if only for a couple of meters, even for a small coin. Because it is from such small deeds that the path to a great civilization begins. And as long as there is dirt in the world, literally or figuratively, we will always need masters of clean paths in whatever guise they appear to us today. Their work is an eternal symbol of the struggle of order against chaos, light against darkness, cleanliness against dirt. And in this eternal battle, even the simplest broom can become a weapon of victory. Gazing at old photographs from the late 19th century, one can spot these figures in the background. Blurred by long exposures, they appear as ghosts. But if you look closely, you can discern a proud posture, a confident grip on the broom. They were not ashamed of their work. For many of them, it was honest bread, earned through their own labor, not by theft. In a world where social mobility was almost non-existent, where birth determined destiny, they found their small freedom at the crossroads of two streets. They were masters of their own destiny precisely to the extent that was possible under those conditions, and that deserves respect. We should not pity them from the height of our comfortable century. We must pay them our debt of memory. For the foundation of our well-being is mixed, in part, with the dirt they cleared and the small coins they clutched in their chilled palms. History is not just kings and generals. History is young Jack from Piccadilly Circus, who on a rainy November Tuesday in 1888 helped an unknown girl cross the road, smiled at her, and perhaps by this simple act, changed someone's fate for the better. This is the magic of everyday history, woven from millions of small actions, unnoticeable yet essential. This chapter of history is closed forever. Asphalt reliably covers the old cobblestones. The roar of engines has drowned out the echo of footsteps. But if you listen to the wind blowing through modern avenues, you can sometimes hear a quiet rustle. It is the sound of a broom clearing the way. This is the memory of the city, which no reagents can erase. The city remembers its little sanitation workers, and we must remember. Because without a past, there is no future, and without a clean path, it is impossible to take a step forward. And every time we step onto the zebra of a modern crosswalk, we walk in the footsteps of those who once stood here with a broom, guarding the boundaries of cleanliness in an ocean of urban grime. Their watch is over, but the light of their small feet continues to shine through the depths of time, reminding us of the dignity of labor and the strength of the human spirit.